Okay, well, we're going to be in Romans chapter 9. If you'd like to go ahead and please open up your Bible, and let's go to Romans chapter 9. So let's kind of roll up and keep the idea of these next three chapters and where Paul's going with this. And so we talked last week looking at chapter 9 after he's built up the idea of where is this relationship with God and Israel. Remember, he's talking to a church that's divided in Rome, a church that's divided between Gentiles and Jews, and he's kind of leveled the playing ground and telling everybody that you're all sinners, that every one of us have fallen short. And then how are you saved? And that's something that's important because it's going to come up here. It's how is a person found right before God? How is he justified? And Paul has said very clearly that it's through faith. And he pointed out Abraham. The Abraham, before he was a Jew, before he was circumcised, that's when he was found faithful. And it's not about doing works. It wasn't about anything that was special about Abraham other than God said, Abraham. And I think that's interesting because a lot of times we look and we go, well, man, Abraham must have been the best man there was. He must have been the best man. And so God looked around on the earth and said, oh, Abraham, you the man. You the one that's good. So we're going to pick you. And I think tonight when we look at this, and we were talking about it last week in chapter 9 here, is the idea of who God chooses and when. Because that's important. It's just like there's a part of this that reminds me of like a parent having to explain to a kid, the children, why they do what they do. And sometimes you just got to look at your kid and go, look, I'm the boss. You're never going to completely understand why I do what I do. And it's not going to be until you become an adult that you're going to figure it out. And that's the same kind of with us. And that's the way that Paul is almost like reading into, as he's discussing this, you can see his brain going, okay, I know what they're going to think. Now those that are the Jews reading this, they're going to say, okay, well, you said to us that, we messed up. So what purpose was there for us at all? Why did God even use us? And so he uses 9 to establish what was going on in the past and God's relationship to those that seemed to be on the outside and in the inside. And so then in 10, he's going to look at the present relationship that's going on between the Gentiles, the Jews, and God's plan. 11, then he's going to look further down at the future. The idea, basically, these 3 chapters are looking at God's plan, what God has done, and that it's consistent, that it didn't change and get amended along the way, that somehow that as God was working through this, that, he would go along and something would happen and God have to deviate and, okay, make the plan this direction. And then, okay, well, let's now change this direction. And now, wow, that Jacob, so I'm going to have to do something else. Or this king did something, so now I'm going to have to do something else. And it just keeps changing. And that somehow, and then all of a sudden, if you were to really ramp that through history, you'd come along and then go, wow, man, they rejected Jesus. So what did God do? Well, he had to go to the Gentiles because the Gentiles were the only ones that take it and the Jews rejected it. So now we're on the outs. And stop. Quit trying to read into, you could just see God going, stop. This has been from the beginning. There's nothing that's changed. Everything's consistent from when I said to Adam and Eve in the garden to what I told Abraham. I said that you're the man that I'm going to choose and through you. And now listen to me. It's almost like a father saying, listen to me now. I'm going to choose you, and it's going to be Isaac. And that it's going to then be through Isaac's descendants that this one special blessing. Now, yes. All of your descendants as a whole are going to be blessed, and they're going to become a great nation. But let's get specific because, the children of promise are different from the children of the flesh. Biologically, everybody in my family are biological; they're blood relatives. But it doesn't mean that we're all. That's what we're saying here. That not all who came through Isaac, and through Abraham are all the same. It's something God specifically was talking about, and you have to listen to this. Okay, listen to this because it's like if you still think that it's the entire nation, then you're missing out on the connection between what I was doing and working and how I accomplished it. And it wasn't through the mass, biological, blood, flesh people of Abraham's descendants. They were receiving a blessing. I told you that. But this specifically, what I'm fulfilling is through this seed line, through this. And so he gives an example. He gives example of two sets of brothers, doesn't he? He goes through and says, look, compare Isaac and Ishmael. I told Abraham that it was Isaac. He tried to have Ishmael and say, well, I'm going to pick Ishmael. God said, no, you're not. But both were blessed. And you think, well, wait a minute, Ishmael? Yes. Ishmael became mighty. His descendants became mighty nations, rich in their own rights. I mean, to this day, there's as many descendants that are in great nations over in the Middle East that are descendants of Ishmael, just like there are, that are descendants of Abraham. But that's what God's trying to say. Look, don't look at everybody. I'm looking at how did I fulfill my promise, and what does it mean for you? As you're sitting there listening to this letter, if you're a Jew or you're a Gentile, what does that mean? It means that not everybody that's biological is going to get this. And it doesn't have to do with the idea of what you did in works, what you accomplished. No accomplishment is going to overcome it. And he used the example of Jacob and Esau, doesn't he? Because he said, hey, I picked those before they were born to show you. He could have just let it go. Think about it. I mean, he could have just said, I'm just going to go ahead and just let this go. But he did it before they were born. And he told Rebekah, didn't he? He said, Rebekah, you're going to have 2 children, and one of them, the youngest, will be served by the oldest, which was not logical. And did it happen? Yes. Exactly. Why? Why would God do that? Because he says, I'm demonstrating to you. I'm showing you that what I'm doing, that I'm in control and that I'm taking care of this. So then when you look at all this choice and the way God's choosing this one and rejecting that, you remember he talked about hating Esau, and we dealt with that idea, that word hate, and it was a dislike less, than the other one, being loved and favored. And it was because God said, I choose Israel. And I'm going to bring that. So that meant he was going to receive some special favoritism because God had to ensure it. But Esau, he also took a different route, didn't he? He took a different route, and the descendants of him become Edom. And when we looked over there in the prophecies, looking at that historically, was the idea that they end up, he uses the brothers' names, and then he goes to the national level and says, look, Edom did this horrible thing. And that's what Paul is quoting back on and showing that God showed a favoritism to one over the other. Jacob over Esau, Israel over Esau. So, does that mean he's unfair? Now, I know, everybody, my family, my brothers and sister, said I was a favorite. That oh man, you were the favorite. You got away with everything. I said, I didn't get away with everything. What happened was I had a real radical older brother and a real radical younger brother, and I just kept my mouth shut and did what I wanted. And I told them, they just looked at you two because you were so busy getting in trouble that they never looked at me. That's all. But you tell them, and even to this day, my brother, they kind of look at me. Well, I looked at them and thought the same thing. But we have that idea, don't we? It's like, well, you're the favorite. You're the favorite. And we try to come up with that, and so it's not that God's being unfair. Why do we as children try to look at our parents and say, well, this is fair and that's unfair, and that's why he uses. And then he uses 2 examples historically to demonstrate. Now Moses wasn't, again, somebody who was extra righteous. It was something that God had looked into the future, planned, and was going to utilize Moses's person, in a sense, to carry forward a promise that went back to who? It went back to Abraham. And so he gives one, and he's talking about God has the right to show mercy to whom he wants to give mercy, and he can give wrath or show wrath upon those who he wants to show wrath. In other words, I can bless one or I can curse one. That's what I'm doing. I can do that. But the ultimate goal of what I'm doing is to accomplish the promise. That's the point I want you to remember. You can see God saying that. That's what I want you to remember. So he says, Moses, And he gives the example of where the calves had been molded and all that going on, and that they should have been all wiped out. God should have just wiped them all out at Mount Sinai and said, no. But he didn't. And he showed, even with Moses, mercy. And that was something that, God wanted to at times to just wipe them all out. Remember one time Moses said, God, if you wipe them all out, what's that going to say to everybody? If you wipe them all out, then all the nations around are going to say, what'd you do? You brought them out of Egypt so that you could just wipe them out? I don't think God for one moment was going to do that per se, but I think it was for Moses to consider, you have no right. I should wipe all of you out because of your indignation towards me, your treatment and the way you were acting. I should just take you out. But God showed and demonstrated his mercy through them. But Pharaoh, on the other hand, God took the opportunity of a person to take him and harden his heart. And Becky, you had said that you'd looked it up and saw as well and was surprised because, sometimes we forget that there's out of those 7 times of the hardening, 10 total, but, there's like 4 of them that where Pharaoh hardens his own heart. And so what's going on here? So what he's saying is, and he could have probably gone to any ruler, any nation that was arrogant like that, and that person would have been hardened. They would have hardened. So God's saying at the right time, there was this leader that was there with that personality. He could have waited to the next Pharaoh, or he could have done the sooner Pharaoh, if you think about it, but he waited. He knew this one Pharaoh was going to be in such a spiritual condition that whenever he brought Moses in front of him, that alone would harden. And we've seen that with people that react to Christians. They harden, don't they? You get in front of them, you try to be nice, and they harden. Oh, you're a Christian, and things like that. It's like you see that. And so you can see Moses coming. And remember, he was an Egyptian. He was kind of a stepbrother to the Pharaoh because he was raised in his house. He killed an Egyptian. He took off for 40 years, and he was doing what? With goats? Ugh, to an Egyptian. And then he comes in. He's got the arrogance to stand before me and say, let your people go. Oh, they're your people? Oh, that's right. You were fetched out of the river, weren't you? And now you've got the audacity to stand before me and say, just let all those Hebrews go? No. So I think it needed to be Moses and the relationship that him and Pharaoh had. And so God's saying, I took advantage and I used that opportunity because I knew what was Pharaoh going to do. And so it's kind of like, God would say, okay, let my people go. And then he would say no, so God would one-up him. And then God would do something else, and it would just, you'd see that Moses become hardened. The Pharaoh would get harder and rebel back, even to the point when he finally just gave up after the firstborn were dead and the people are fleeing. What happened? Then God comes in, and they harden their heart, and they go, they took all of our money, they destroyed our nation, and they try to go after him. And then what happened to the Red Sea? Because of the hardness of their heart. So God's saying, look at the 2 people. Look, and they historically come together and overlap. It was Moses and Pharaoh. His point again is, I'm fulfilling what I promised from the beginning of time. That I'm going to bring a Messiah. And I did it. And I used things that I chose. And that my sovereign right was to do that. And so I think the key verse here is in 23. When you look at 23, because now he then kind of brings it to a current application, or an application that was always there, but they couldn't see it because they were so focused on the Mosaic Law. But it was always there. And this concept that what was going to happen? God was going to bless many nations through Abraham's seed. They knew that. Come on. They could quote that. But did they understand that? They could sit and say, many nations will be blessed through your seed. He didn't say, through all your descendants, plural, all the nations, plural, would be blessed. He said, no, through your seed. One descendant would come, and all nations. Now, to us, it would be all races of people. no matter who you were. Now, if you're a Jew and you don't have the rest of the story and you're very focused on a physical nation and everything, all you hear is, our nation's going to bless everybody. And then look at the way they acted whenever, Jesus did come. How did they act? They were like, oh, yeah, the Messiah. Even his own apostles, didn't they? His own disciples were saying, oh, yeah, let's get to Jerusalem and have him overthrow Pilate. And let's have him take over. And then he will rule there. And then we will throw out the Romans. We'll clean up the town. And things will be great. And they just had that. They missed it. They missed it. And they missed it in so many different ways. And that one's very obvious. We know they were looking for the physical kingdom, the Messiah, to bring it. In the same way, they missed it. It was to bless the Gentiles as well. Look at the challenges that the first century church had in just bringing Gentiles into with them, right? Remember Cornelius' house in Acts chapter 10? When he talks about whenever he had to have the dream in Joppa, and then he goes in and he walks, even after he had the dream, what did he dream about? The unveiling and the unclean food, and God says, eat, Peter. And Peter's like, I've never eaten anything that's, not approved, that's defiled. And God says, eat. 3 times he did it. And then he's, oh, wow, okay. And then he says, now there's somebody downstairs, I want you to go with him. And then he travels to Joppa, and he goes there to Cornelius' house, and he walks in, and he goes, you know that it's not really good for, a Jew to associate with a Gentile. And Cornelius goes, well, I had a dream by an angel, and an angel told me to send for you. And it took Peter a little bit to go, oh, man. And he even retells the story, and he goes, and when I saw the Holy Spirit fall on them, those Gentiles, like they did us, Jews, I had to go, well, God must want this. You see how difficult that was? And even the problem that they continued to have in integrating the Gentiles on trying to teach them how to be a good Jewish Christian. They were Gentiles through trying to enforce different customs and traditions, dietary as well as circumcision and things like that. So this is why I say 23 is important, because it's showing, again, God completed his promise, and his promise has always been to bring a blessing to all races of people. He's already established in this book that everybody's a sinner. Nobody can be saved. Abraham wasn't a Jew. Abraham was saved because of his faith. And that's what he's trying to bring up again. And so as God has executed this plan, and you're trying to look at it being righteous and unrighteous and not fair and all these things, he goes, look, what if he's willing to make known the wealth of his glory on the objects of mercy that he's prepared beforehand for glory, even us, whom he has called, not only from the Jews, but also from the Gentiles. So God has chosen this. This is part of God's plan. And so 25 and 26 is when he then talks about, and he brings this in brilliantly. This is something that I found interesting, is if you ever really go through and look at all the quotes that Paul does when it comes to the prophets, and you go over and look at them and you read them, you would have to kind of go, is he really using that appropriately? Because in a very brilliant Hebrewic way of logic that we can't really comprehend, he's able to take the exact passages, and of course it's guidance with the Holy Spirit, and bring them into an application that just is kind of like a face slapper. It's like, wow, we never could see that before when we read those prophets. We just couldn't see what that was really talking to. And now it's clear. That just makes so much sense. And that's what he's going to show here. Now, so when he talks about Hosea, and he's quoting 2 places in Hosea, in Hosea 1:10 and 2:23. And this is what he's quoting in Romans 9, verse 25 and 26. He also says in Hosea, I will call those who were not my people, and I will call her who was unloved my beloved. And in the very place where it was said to them, you are not my people, they will be called sons of the living God. So if you didn't know your Hebrew history, you would sit there and go, what? Okay, you're talking about choice and the Gentiles and integration of all these people. And this seems to kind of make sense. You're saying God is what? I will call those who are not my people. Who are those? Now, in this context, he's talking about Gentiles, non-Jews. And he's taking them to Hosea. Now, God has, and this is what is so amazing. If you realize what Hosea had to go through, what did God do to Hosea? God had Hosea marry Gomer, who was a prostitute, that was going to be unfaithful. He basically took a prophet and made his life a living parable. A living parable. So that when they looked at when he looked at Hosea and looked at Gomer, his wife, and saw what was going on and how righteous and good that Hosea was, how in the world would he go and marry a prostitute? I mean, I know my mama would get upset. My mom would really want to intervene. What are you thinking? This is a prostitute. She's sleeping with men. She has been, and of all of them, I'll bet you she was one of the worst ones about her fidelity to anything. And so he's giving a living parable, an example. Hosea is righteous, this very unfaithful wife. Now, who are those? So we say it's a parable, it's the putting aside things so that we can compare and look at. Well, Hosea is symbolic of God. Very faithful, very loving, very forgiving. And Israel is Gomer, the unfaithful, adulterous wife. And in that, I think we need to study that. You got to look at that. I just love the way he gives even the children their names. Man, I'm glad I wasn't a child of his, because some of the names that he gives to the children are representative of what God thinks about what they're going on. And that's why he says, I will call her who is unloved. So what he's describing here is really the relationship at times God would say, that she would run off and she would become in a relationship, in her immorality, and then have a child out of wedlock, out of adultery. And then God would say, now go take her back. Now, who could do that? What husband or wife? Honestly. It's hard. Now, they do it. It happens. I understand that. That where one is very unfaithful, but one that is a habitual unfaithful. One time, okay. But Gomer is constantly, no matter what Hosea does, she is constantly unfaithful. No matter how many times he forgives her, she comes home with another kid. Now, who would put up with this? And that's God. So there's times in this story of Hosea where God is putting her away. And she's not a part. And that's what he's kind of describing here, is this idea of her representing Israel. And there are times where God will say, you are not part. You are divorced. I'm putting you away, and you're not my people anymore. And then there's a time where he's finally going to say, I will bring them back. And this really has to do with the type of relationship that the Israelites had with God, whether it was Israel, the 10 northern tribes, when they go off into captivity, or it was end up being Judah with this idea. And that's what he's trying to say to them. So now, if you're a Jew and you're listening to this, you would have to realize that was us. There was a time where we were adulterous to God, and God put us away, divorced us, and made us not his people. And then he made us his people. So if he could do that, could he do it with anyone? So if the Gentiles, at one time, before Abraham came along, that the Gentiles were not his people, or when, let's just say when Abraham comes along and now it looks like God has his people, he put away the ungodly? Can God not do that too for them? What makes you so special? You were adulterous yourself. God put you away and he brought you back. And so he's trying to show, because he just said about why can't God show his glory on that? Why can't God do that with the Jews and the Gentiles? Just like what we know historically, the prophet Hosea in his living parable life demonstrated there. And so that's why he quotes directly from Hosea. What a great one. And then he jumps over to Isaiah. Now what's interesting is that Isaiah one in 27 is the same message as far as the number and the children of the sea when he talks about here that is also mentioned in Hosea. There's this idea about this abundance of the generation and the people. But look what he says. And so now he's talked about Hosea, about how God has put away his people. He's brought them back. And now here in 27 and 29, and Isaiah cries out on behalf of Israel. Though the number of the children of Israel are as the sand of the sea, only a remnant will be saved. For the Lord will execute his sentence on the earth completely and quickly, just as Isaiah predicted. If the Lord of armies had not left us descendants, we would have become like Sodom. We would have resembled Gomorrah. What happened there? There was nobody faithful. And they were gone. Now let's go back to Gomer. Gomer was never faithful. And if God hadn't have said, Hosea, take her back. Now remember, living parable, who do they represent? This is great. Think about this. He's taken the prophet Isaiah and he's taken Hosea, and Hosea is an example of an unfaithful to a righteous person, Israel and God. And then he brings up the idea that there's only a remnant. Now he's making it national. He's saying, look at it nationally. You know what? If it wasn't for God, there would be none of you left. God could have wiped you all out, just like he used the example of Moses receiving mercy and the Israelites at Mount Sinai. God chose to give you mercy. He should have wiped you all out when you built that calf and you started worshiping the way you did. So here he's then bringing up that even Isaiah cries out, though you have all this huge nation of people, there's only a few that are really faithful. And that's it. And so God is going to come. Now, and if God hadn't have protected the remnant, then they would have been in Sodom and Gomorrah. There would have been nothing left. So it's the logical thinking of a Hebrew to try to blame God. It's like a kid that's been spurned and now he has to play fairly with the Gentiles. And now it's like, the equality issue. And so he's saying, look, it's equal. This is what I've been planning to do all along. And so now he deals with talking about their rejection in verse 30 and 32. What shall we say then? That the Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness obtained it? That is, a righteousness that is by faith. But Israel, even though pursuing a law of righteousness, did not obtain it. Why not? Because they pursued it not by faith, but, as if it were possible, by works. They stumbled over the stumbling stone. So, how can you find righteousness if you're not looking for it? Well, now you're trying to say that you had to be good to be looking for it. That somehow now your works or your abilities, and that's what he's trying to wipe out. No, you don't get it. Righteousness, again, is outside of your capabilities. It's what God has provided. And the only way you can do this is understand that and know that it's your belief, it's your faith that saves you. And that here, it wasn't because, they weren't pursuing it. They were living an ungodly life, weren't they? At least the Jews had a temple. At least they had a sacrificial system. But what did the Gentiles have? And God gave it to them. God gave them his son as a sacrifice. And it's like, how could they find it if they were so ungodly and not accepted? And he said, and how could the Israelites, the Hebrews, not get it? Because it doesn't matter whether you're a Gentile or you're a Jew, it has to come back to the idea of faith. And that's what he says, that the Gentiles were found righteous because of their faith, and that the problem was that the Jews were trying to pursue it through works of the law. And they had made that such a principle, and that's what I was interested in looking at when he says here. Every time, especially in Romans, when the word law is used, and it says here, like Israel, even though pursuing a law of righteousness, you notice that's a law of righteousness, and this is really more of a principle of righteousness, not specifically to Mosaic law, but they had a principle of righteousness, and it's expressed really if you look at the Pharisees. They had a principle of their own self-righteousness, and they thought that if they could legalize and dictate every aspect of how you were to behave, and you just followed that, then you'd be found righteous. He says, no, that caused you to miss the point. Just think of how many times Jesus had to take a commandment and explain it. Guys, it's not about murdering. It's about hate. Guys, the Sermon on the Mount, look how much re-education he had to go through. Now, was it that adultery was okay? No, it's not. But if you're looking externally, and a person just outside, he's not doing anything, but in his heart, he's corrupt. He's a hater. He's defiled inside. And that's what Jesus had to try to teach, to break this system of a principle that they thought was right. Well, just as long as I don't go over and stab him in the chest and kill him, as long as I just don't do it outwardly, I'm righteous. I'm good. You're good. You're lucky I don't go stab and kill you because I want to maintain my righteousness, but I hate you. No! But you see, that's what they thought. They thought that became a principle of righteousness to themselves. And that's what Jesus battled, wasn't it, constantly? It's not what goes in that defiles you. It's what comes out. And so that's where they miss their mark. It's not God. And how can you blame the Gentiles because they accepted it? Well, let's back up again. How can you all be found right before God? Faith. That's it. It's not an X word type of thing you can go and do or control. It's a faith that comes from within your own individual spirit. And so that's why he says, and I underlined it on this, is why not? Why can we do that? And so that's when we look and back over in Romans 3:21 and 23. That's what he's talking about. The same type of a thing is, but now apart from the law, the righteousness of God, although it is attested by the law and the prophets, has been disclosed, namely the righteousness of God through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ, for all who believe. There is no distinction, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And if you look at the in Isaiah 8:14 and 15, he talks about this stone. That's where he's quoting that from when he says that they're going to stumble. They actually stumbled over that concept. And he's using this when he talks about, and it's interesting because Isaiah is talking about a sanctuary and somehow but a stone that makes a person trip, a rock that makes one stumble, to the two houses of Israel. So this also is helping to show that Isaiah was even talking about the idea that Jesus, the Messiah, people were going to stumble over. It was going to cause them to not understand what was going on. So many will stumble here in Isaiah 15 over the stone, over the rock, and will fall and be seriously injured and will be ensnared and be captured. And so that then the next section he talks about, he's quoting again from the prophets, Isaiah, saying, just as it is written, look, I am laying in Zion a stone that will cause people to stumble and a rock that will make them fall. Yet the one who believes in him will not be put to shame. The one who has faith will not be put to shame. And he's tying it in again to exactly what the prophet said was, therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Look, I am laying a stone in Zion, an approved stone, set in place as a precious cornerstone for the foundation. The one who maintains his faith will not panic. Like, everything hinged around the acceptance of Jesus. And that was difficult to us today. You become a Christian based on that principle, and we understand historically he existed. We've been listening to Christian thoughts all our lives. We were raised, but this is something new as people in this first century was the idea, and he had to show how the prophets and everything were connecting these together and showing them all. And so we're going to go ahead and stop there, and we will continue next week, and we'll get to chapter 10, in which is talking about the current relationship that they have with God's plan. So if you're with us this evening, and there's something we can do to help you in your relationship with God, and if you're online or there's somebody that needs to find out more about how to become a Christian, we hope that you would contact us, let us know that we can reach out and help you understand or have a Bible study or anything. And if there's something that we can do for those that are with us this afternoon, we're going to sing this invitation song and let us know, and we'd be happy to pray with you or help you any way we can. So let us sing.